The Texas sun burned gold over the horizon when the wagons rolled into Dusty Creek, a quiet town that hadn't seen a wedding in nearly 2 years. Folks leaned out their doors, curious about the fuss, because everyone knew this wasn't an ordinary wedding. It was the day Clara May Collins, 19 and scared as a colt, was to marry Grant Wesson, the richest cowboy in 3 counties. Clara's father, Hank Collins, owned nothing but a dying ranch and a mountain of debt. The Wesson family owned nearly everything else: the cattle trails, the banks, the grain store, and even the water rights. When Hank couldn't pay what he owed, Grant made an offer no man in Hank's boots could refuse. "Your ranch for your daughter's hand," he'd said. And Hank, trembling, had agreed. Clara had cried for 2 nights straight before the wedding. She loved the land more than any man, the smell of hay in the morning, the sound of creek water running over rocks, but love didn't pay bills, and her father was dying inside, crushed by debt and shame. So she stood before the mirror on the morning of her wedding, wearing a borrowed dress of white lace yellowed by time, her hands trembling as her best friend June pinned wildflowers into her hair. "You look beautiful." "Clara," June whispered. "I feel trapped," Clara murmured, like a bird in a gilded cage. June hesitated, then said softly, "Maybe the cage has a door you haven't seen yet." The sound of hoofbeats echoed outside, Grant Wesson arriving at the ranch. Clara swallowed hard. She'd seen him only twice before. The first time, he was on horseback in town, tipping his hat to the preacher. The second time, he stood in her father's parlor, tall, sun-browned, with sharp blue eyes that seemed to see right through her. He wasn't cruel, just distant, like a man carved from stone. When he dismounted that morning, his black suit fit him like it had been stitched by angels. The sunlight caught in his blonde hair. Every woman in Dusty Creek would have swooned, except Clara. He nodded once. "Miss Collins." She nodded back. "Mr. Wesson." And with that, her life changed forever. The chapel was full of whispers. Some pitied her, some envied her. "That girl's marrying into gold," one woman muttered. "Gold can't buy happiness," another said. "But it can sure buy a house bigger than her daddy's barn." Clara stood beside Grant, her heart hammering as the preacher spoke. Grant's hand rested at his side, steady, unshaking. She could barely breathe. When the preacher said, "Do you take this man?" she hesitated, just a heartbeat too long. Gasps rippled through the crowd. Then she whispered, "I do." Grant looked at her, unreadable. His voice, when it came, was quiet but certain. "I do." They kissed under the murmurs of Dusty Creek, the scent of dust and roses mingling in the hot air. When the vows ended, Grant placed something in her hand, a folded piece of paper. "What's this?" she whispered. "Your wedding gift," he said. But before she could unfold it, he led her out of the church and into the waiting carriage. Grant's ranch sat on the far side of Dusty Creek, where the hills rolled green and the river carved a silver line through the land. His mansion was the largest in 3 states, a white 2-story house with wraparound porches, stables bigger than the Collins ranch, and acres of wildflowers in bloom. But to Clara, it felt like a prison made of wood and silence. Grant was kind but distant. He spoke little. He worked hard. He treated her with respect, but not affection. Each evening, he came home dusty from the range, nodded politely, ate dinner in silence, and retired to his study. For weeks, they lived like strangers under the same roof. Then one night, Clara finally unfolded the paper he'd given her on their wedding day. It wasn't a contract. It wasn't money. It was a deed to her father's ranch. The ranch she thought she'd lost forever. Grant had paid the debts in full and signed the land back in her name. The signature at the bottom wasn't his father's, nor a lawyer's. It was his own. She stared at it until tears blurred her vision. The next morning, she found him saddling his horse at dawn. "You gave my father's land back," she said softly. He didn't look up. "It was never mine to keep." Why? Because I didn't marry you to own you, he said simply. I married you to protect what you love. And with that, he rode off toward the hills. Clara began to see him differently after that. When she helped in the stables, he joined her, rolling up his sleeves, his shirt clinging to sun-warmed skin. He taught her how to ride bareback across the open prairie. He smiled, just a little more each day. He wasn't the cold man she thought. He was shy, quiet, careful with his words. At supper one evening, she asked him, "Why did you never marry before?" He paused over his plate. "Because every woman I met wanted my money or my name. I wanted someone who wanted the land, the horses, the sky." Clara smiled softly. "I've always loved the sky." His eyes met hers for the first time, really met them, and she felt something shift between them, like the start of spring after a long winter. One night, a thunderstorm rolled through Dusty Creek. The wind tore shingles off roofs, lightning split trees, and the river swelled into a beast. Grant was out with the ranch hands, trying to save the cattle. Clara waited by the window, heart pounding, until she couldn't bear it anymore. She threw on her coat and rode into the storm. She found him half a mile from the barn, struggling to free a calf stuck in the mud. Rain lashed his face, thunder cracked overhead. "Grant!" she shouted. "What are you doing here? I wasn't about to let you face this alone." Together, they pulled the calf free, mud up to their knees, rain stinging their skin. When they finally reached shelter, soaked and shivering, he looked at her, really looked. "You could have been killed," he said. "So could you." For a moment, the storm faded, and all she could hear was their breathing. Then he took her face in his hands and kissed her, slow, fierce, and full of the things he'd never said aloud. Outside, the rain roared, but inside something new began. The storm had passed, leaving Dusty Creek shining under a clean blue sky. The town was buzzing again. "Did you hear? They say she went out into the storm for him. They say he kissed her right there in the barn." For once, Clara didn't care what people whispered. She walked into town beside Grant, her hand in his. When they passed the general store, old Mrs. Dawson called out, "Well, Mr. Wesson, looks like your bride's tamed you." Grant only smiled. Maybe she just reminded me what home feels like. The townsfolk laughed and nodded. But when Clara stopped by the bank later that day, they found out what really silenced them all. Pinned on the bulletin board was a public notice, signed and sealed. Effective immediately. The Wesson Ranch will donate 50 acres of land and water access to Dusty Creek for community farming, under the name Clara Wesson Trust. The people gasped. Grant had given half his best land away, to the town, in her name. No one had ever seen such a thing. Even the mayor stood speechless. Clara turned to him, stunned. "Why?" Grant took her hand, smiling softly. "Because the woman I married believes land is meant to be lived on, not owned." The gift that changed everything. From that day on, everything changed. The town built a new schoolhouse on part of the land. Families farmed the rest. People who once whispered about Clara now tipped their hats when she passed. She worked beside Grant, tending to the horses and teaching the children to ride. Their love grew quietly, like wildflowers after a long drought. One evening, a year later, as the sun dipped behind the hills, Grant led her to the very spot they'd first met, the ridge overlooking Dusty Creek. He handed her a small box. Inside was a simple gold locket. When she opened it, she found 2 tiny pictures, her father, smiling in his old hat, and herself on horseback, hair flying in the wind. "He had that photo made before he passed," Grant said softly. "Told me to keep it safe until you smiled again." Tears filled her eyes. "You spoke to him? He asked me to promise I'd take care of you. I told him I'd do more than that. I'd love you until my last breath." She threw her arms around him, the prairie wind wrapping them both in its quiet hymn. Years later, people still talked about that wedding. Not because a rich cowboy had married a poor girl. Not because she was young, or because he was powerful, but because of what came after. They remembered the gift that silenced the whole town. They remembered the woman who rode into the storm for her husband. They remembered how Dusty Creek became a place of hope because two people dared to love without pride or fear. And every spring, when the fields bloomed with wildflowers, children would run through them laughing, land once owned by one man, now shared by all. At the heart of it stood the Wesson house on the hill, where Clara and Grant still sat on the porch at sunset, hands entwined, watching the land that had once divided them now bind them forever. Clara often thought about the paper Grant had given her that day, the simple deed that started it all. To everyone else, it was just ink and words. To her, it was proof that love wasn't about power or wealth. It was about choosing someone's heart over everything else. She smiled at him across the porch as the wind whispered through the fields, carrying laughter from the town below. "Grant," she said softly, "do you ever regret it? Giving so much away?" He looked out at the horizon, golden and endless. "Not for a second," he said. "The day I gave it away, I gained everything that mattered." She leaned her head against his shoulder. The world was quiet except for the rustle of wheat, the cry of distant hawks, and the heartbeat of the land they loved. And in that silence, the legend of Dusty Creek lived on. The story of a girl who was forced to marry a millionaire cowboy, but whose wedding gift silenced the whole town and turned a bargain into a forever kind of love. 2 years after the wedding, Dusty Creek faced a drought unlike any seen before. The sky turned hard and white, the riverbed cracked, and the crops that once fed the town began to die. Grant stood on the porch, hat in hand, his jaw tight. If this keeps up, folks won't make it through the summer. Clara laid a hand on his arm. "We've come through worse." He shook his head. "Not like this." But she refused to give in to fear. The woman who once wept over a forced marriage now led meetings in the town square, organizing water runs, ration schedules, and shared wells. When the well behind the Wesson ranch ran dry, Clara ordered their last barrels of water delivered to the town first. "You sure about this, ma'am?" one ranch hand asked. She nodded firmly. "A house is just wood without a town around it." People whispered again, but this time they didn't question her heart. They called her the heart of Dusty Creek. When rain finally came weeks later, it was Clara who ran out first, arms open wide, laughing as drops soaked her hair. Grant watched her, smiling with quiet pride. "You saved them, Clara," he murmured. She turned, beaming. "No, Grant, we saved each other." The stranger at the gate. One autumn morning, a stranger rode into town. A young man about 20, with tired eyes and a scar along his jaw. He asked for Clara by name. "I'm Luke," he said when they met at the porch. "Your father once helped mine. He said if I ever needed a home, I should find the Collins family." Clara felt a tug in her heart. "You found it." Grant looked at her curiously but trusted her instinct. They gave Luke a job tending the horses. Weeks passed, and Luke proved to be hardworking and quiet, until one night, he saved Grant's life. A stallion broke free in the dark, panicked by thunder, and nearly trampled Grant in the corral. Luke dove in, pulling him out at the last second, taking the hit himself. When Grant knelt beside him afterward, blood running down the young man's arm, he said quietly, "You've got courage, son." Luke smiled faintly. "Guess I learned that from watching the two of you." From that day, Luke became family. He often said he'd never seen love like theirs, and he was right. The letter from the city. One winter morning, a letter arrived from Austin. A lawyer's seal glimmered on the envelope. Grant opened it, frowned, then handed it to Clara. It was an offer from investors wanting to buy out Dusty Creek's land to build a railway line. The town would be paid handsomely, but the farms and pastures would vanish forever. Grant looked at her. "If we say yes, we'll be rich beyond measure. Clara's face hardened. And what happens to the people? To the land? He sighed. They'll move on. She folded the letter neatly. Then my answer's no. That evening, she called a town meeting. She stood before everyone, farmers, widows, children, and said, "This town was built on promises, not profits. We didn't survive drought and storms to sell our roots for gold." The crowd erupted in applause. When the investors came, they found a wall of townsfolk waiting, and one determined woman standing at the front, her husband beside her. The railway went elsewhere. Dusty Creek stayed whole. The legacy of love. Years turned softly into decades. The Wesson house on the hill grew quieter. Luke took over much of the ranching work. Children Clara had once taught to ride grew up and had children of their own. Clara's hair turned silver, but her eyes still sparkled like the creek she'd loved since girlhood. One summer evening, she and Grant sat side by side, rocking on the porch as the sun melted into the horizon. "Remember the first time you brought me here?" she asked. He chuckled. "You looked ready to run for the hills." "I almost did." He smiled. "But you stayed." "I stayed," she said softly, "because somewhere deep down, I knew the man they called a millionaire cowboy had a heart worth 1,000 fortunes." He took her hand, rough and warm. "And I stayed because the girl who thought she was being sold ended up teaching me what love really means." The wind carried laughter from the town below, where children played in the fields of the Clara Wesson Trust, land she'd helped save, nourish, and share. As twilight deepened, Clara leaned against him and whispered, "We built something beautiful, didn't we?" Grant nodded, eyes soft. "More than land, more than a ranch. We built a home that outlived us." The stars came out, bright and endless, and in the quiet night of Dusty Creek, their story became legend. A love born of duty, tested by hardship, and crowned with grace. The next generation. Years after Clara and Grant were gone, townsfolk still told their tale at bonfires. Children would ask, "Is it true a cowboy gave away half his fortune for love?" And the elders would nod. He did, and she gave him everything that gold could never buy. The Wesson Ranch became a museum of sorts, its doors open to all. On the porch, 2 rocking chairs still faced the sunset. Some said that if you sat there at dusk, you could almost hear them laughing softly, the wind whispering through the wildflowers they once planted together. The story of Dusty Creek remained a reminder for generations that sometimes what begins as a forced marriage becomes the truest partnership of all, and that the most powerful gift is not wealth, but love that gives back to the world.